This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Bandits and Bad Magic by Lesley Herron. Chapter 6, Torea. The gentle pattering of raindrops on the canopy overhead gave way to an immediate and relentless downpour. It had taken them so long to find their way out from the Dryad Woods that what started as a nice morning had transformed into a dour and gray afternoon, the silence broken by the occasional clap of thunder as lightning lit up the sky. The air was bitter and cold, with an icy breeze that rustled through the foliage on the outer edges of the forest. Once beyond the magic of the Dryads, the forest had shed its vibrant and lively colors. Their surroundings became more bleak and meager, the chill of the rainy air settling into a thick fog that hovered just above the ground. The trees were spindly and tall, with their branches bearing little to no leaves. Their white, chalky bark painted an illusion of snow as they traversed along a faded, winding path. Evan rearranged the scarf around his neck to cover his head.
Is it possible to teach others how to do magic?
He was asking mostly to keep his mind off the cold, but he had always thought it would be fun to have superpowers. Their cold trek had been aggravated by the injuries they sustained from the Spriggan attack. They had been pelted non-stop in their efforts to exit the Dryad Woods, and were left coated in a layer of sap and forest debris. Atlas stifled a tremble as he pulled his robe up tighter around his neck. He gave his hat a violent shake before wringing it out, sighing a little at the thick stream of water escaping the fabric. He plopped the soggy thing back on his head, discontent with its lack of protection from the rain. He turned to the small dwarf nestled in the bear's back.
Unfortunately, I doubt I'd make a good teacher, and the Academy only takes those who, like myself and Barry here, show a natural talent for an array of magical abilities.
Evan's brow shot up in surprise as he looked down at the lumbering beast beneath him.
Wait, Barry's a mage?
Atlas raised a finger.
An arcanist, not a mage. But yes, we were both students together. At least, until he got stuck like that.
How'd that happen?
Atlas grimaced.
A story for another time, perhaps. Suffice to say, alcohol and forbidden arts don't mix.
Errik lagged behind the group, listening to them prattling on. He grumbled to himself as he peeled congealed pieces of hardened tree sap from his skin. It was a painful process, made all the more agonizing by the throbbing pain in his arm and leg. The chill in the air stole every last bit of his warmth, even as he pulled his thin shirt tighter around himself. They continued to follow the arrow held in Atlas's open hand until they stumbled out of the forest and onto a muddy main road that led into a small village. The rain pattered off the rooftops, creating a mist that rolled down into the streets. The fog from the forest was encroaching on the outskirts of the town, and what few people were outdoors were scurrying from one building to another, cloaks and hoods pulled up tight. The arrow was pointing towards the center of town, inviting them in, but Atlas pulled to a stop, his boots sinking into one of the water-filled carriage tracks along the road.
Looks like your brother could be in there.
He spun on his heel.
But we can't go in just yet.
Errik slumped a little as he looked from the magician back to the welcoming warmth of the chimney smoke from the nearby buildings.
All I want is a place that's warm, to dry off, eat some food, and maybe take a bath. I'm not going to run.
Atlas shook his head.
No, I mean, you can't go in there looking like that.
Errik frowned, feeling something tickle his ear. He reached up and, with great effort, pulled free a small twig from his hair.
I'm pretty sure these locals are used to filthy appearances.
Atlas hid the half-smirk on his face and leaned in, pointing the king in the direction of several people milling around a guard station near a flimsy wooden fence. They huddled under the small eaves of the building, trying to find some semblance of reprieve from the storm. Each one was darned in simple leather armor and thick hide helmets. Their swords were hidden beneath long red and gold tabards that were emblazoned with a white weeping willow.
Those folks right there might have a thing or two to say about the return of their long-lost king."
Errik swallowed hard, but held his tongue.
"And judging by the symbol on their tabards, they report directly to the Regent Lord. As Barry made clear earlier, you'd probably be wise to avoid that particular reunion. I'd suggest we find a way to disguise you before we traipse into this admirable little hamlet."
Errik fought to keep his composure as he closed his eyes and pushed his fingers into his sap-covered temples.
"Fine."
He massaged a few leaves into his hairline before he opened his eyes once more.
"I suppose you have some sort of disguise spell or something?"
He still clung to the notion that they found this town on a stroke of sheer luck, and not because of some magical arrow. But he was too tired to argue. A broad grin crawled across Atlas's face as he swung out his arm to clap it around the king's shoulders.
"Or something."
In one swift motion, he shoved the other man, face first, into Barry's back haunch, and then hauled him back, tearing out a chunk of wet fur that was now attached to Erik's sap-covered face.
"Abracadabra! Instant disguise! Your own ma wouldn't recognize you."
While Barry and Errik competed to see who could complain the loudest, Bob leaned over and grabbed a handful of leaves off the ground. With a lopsided grin, he pushed them into his face, pressing them along his jawline. The combination of sap and decayed flesh held an impressive amount of the muddy mess in place, and he opened his mouth into a terrifying grin, revealing gray and rotted teeth. With a horrifying wheeze, he mimed the words, "Abracadabra." Atlas rubbed at his chin, looking Errik up and down.
Not bad, but something's still wrong."
He snapped his fingers and pointed.
"It's them royal garbs of yours. Nobody around here has anything quite so, colorful."
Errik scratched at his newly acquired beard, pulling out several loose hairs. He looked down at his beloved, albeit tattered, Hawaiian shirt before dropping his hands in defeat.
"Fine. Plaster me with some leaves and I can be the king of the dryads."
Atlas frowned.
"One, there has never been a king of the dryads. And two, I don't really think they'd take kindly to a monarchy in their woods."
He cast a glance at the forest behind him.
"And I was thinking about borrowing something more traditional."
He lifted a lazy finger to point at a house a ways down the road in the other direction. A line of simple clothes, cloaks, and sheets had been left forgotten in the rain. Atlas turned back to the group.
"Stay here, and I'll procure you some vestments worthy of your station."
Barry made several grunts and growls, motioning at the zombie with a jerk of his giant head.
Right. I'll grab one for him, too."
Atlas turned back to the king.
"Stay here."
As the red-headed wizard jogged away, Errik licked his lips and glanced back at the group of guards. One of them had a double band of gold on his tabard, which he assumed marked the man as the highest ranking of the group. If he could just reach that guard, he could tell them his whole story. It wasn't that far. He could run that in no time. Plus, if the bear tried to chase him down, that might really help sell his story. Could they handle the bear? It was a risk, but one he couldn't avoid. A moment passed, and he continued to just stare at the guards. And then another moment passed, and yet he remained, one foot submerged in muddy water. He wasn't entirely sure why he was hesitating. It wasn't until his gaze flicked back down the road that he realized his moment of freedom had slipped by. Atlas was marching in their direction with an armful of fabric. Errik let out a small sigh. He hoped his brother really was in this town. They would have a surefire way of dealing with this charlatan and his pet bear. It took a little effort and coercion to get the damp green linen cloak wrapped around Errik. He knew he looked the fool here, nearly collapsed beneath the weight of a rain-soaked garment, with muddy open-toed sandals and a face full of stinking animal fur. But he was forced to admit that it would be highly unlikely for anyone to recognize him. Mistake him for a mythical creature, sure, but at least his identity was safe. Bob had been so silent that even Errik had forgotten his presence. So when the zombie shuffled along after them, splashing through the mud, it caused him to jump in panic. He watched as the maid began to wrap numerous tattered blankets around the creature, who held out his arms eagerly. Atlas tied the garments together with lengths of rope until Bob resembled an odd monk underneath a sopping habit. Errik couldn't be certain, but it looked as if the zombie was enjoying itself. Lightning illuminated the sky, and he glanced back over at the guardhouse. The men had disappeared, whether inside or throughout the city, he wasn't sure. His shoulders slumped again, but he was surprisingly unfazed by it.
All right, you all look like proper citizens now, or at the very least, you don't look like yourselves.
Atlas returned the arrow to the palm of his hand and grinned as it swiveled, aiming them towards the heart of the town.
Onward!
Calling this place a town was generous, Errik thought, as they passed by meager hovels and run-down sheds. Most buildings were a single room with wooden walls and clay shingles. He could tell this was a farming village, with large plots of land on either side of the road. He saw only 3 buildings larger than a house as they marched towards the middle of the town. One was a general store, another a run-down church, and the last was the most inviting. A large 2-story building loomed ahead. Sizable windows peppered the ground floor, flooding the dark exterior with warm firelight, with a barn attached to the side that was stabling a number of horses. A rickety sign above the door rocked in the gentle breeze, the tavern's name carved into the wood with a heavy hand. The Grizzly Orchard was open for business, and it was packed. As they approached the center of town, the crossbow bolt wobbled and rolled off Atlas's outstretched palm, landing in the mud at their feet. The last vestiges of light had faded and left them standing in the middle of the darkening road. Atlas gave a slight shrug as he looked down at the piece of wood.
Well, that's as far as it can take us.
He plucked it out of the mud and examined it. The spell had accomplished its task, and the magic had been extinguished, the runes now cracked and broken. Errik raised a brow.
What a surprise! I don't see my brother anywhere.
He resisted the urge to claw away the bear fur on his neck. The tiny hairs were driving him mad. Atlas clicked his tongue against his teeth.
Listen here, Wolfman. I'm not a tracking mage, so I can only get us within the general vicinity. Most magic users are born with a single ability and are unparalleled in whatever that innate talent is.
He gestured to himself.
I, on the other hand, hold more powers in one finger than most village witch doctors.
He shoved his hands on his hips.
As such, a tracking spell by me will only get you in the vicinity.
Errik never brought down his eyebrows as he continued to stare at the charlatan.
Fine, believe whatever you want.
Atlas spun on his heel to face the tavern.
Perhaps he's in there, getting a drink, just like I'm going to do.
He threw an arm around Barry, who had plopped down in the mud.
Don't worry, buddy. With a name like the Grizzly Orchard, I'm sure bears are welcome company.
Errik wanted to protest, but the pull of a warm, dry place and the promise of a hot meal was too compelling. He looked down at Evan, who offered him a small shrug. He sighed and fell in line, the others trailing behind him. They pushed through a heavy door and were greeted by the pleasant sight of a roaring fire and a stone hearth, and the bracing scent of cheap alcohol mixed with cheaper food. The tavern was stuffed with so many tables and chairs that navigating their way towards the bar would be a feat in itself. Each table was filled with waterlogged farmers, sharing a pint and complaining about the ruddy weather. A short woman with bouncy blonde curls was dancing between patrons, taking orders and replacing empty mugs at a dizzying pace. She was twice Evan's height, which only put her at just above Erik's navel, but she skated through the crowd without issue. The bar itself was pushed back against the far wall nearest the kitchen. Casks of ale and bottles of wine were arranged so the barkeeper could easily sling tankards along to the patrons at the counter and refill mugs for the barmaid. The portly man behind the counter looked up to greet them as they began to pile in, sopping wet as they may be. He had a warm smile, a full beard, and large, bat-like ears. He offered them a wave as he gestured to the nearest empty table.
"Evening, good sirs. Come in out of the cold and warm up by the fire. We have the finest mead in all the land, and the food is just as good."
Barry, the last in on account of his size, began to force his way through the doorway. He had to stand to get his backside to squeeze past the doorframe, and his head scraped neatly along the rafters. He let out a grunt as he shook his whole body before dropping back onto all fours, causing the building to shudder.
"By the gods, is that a bear?"
The barkeep scrabbled around behind his bar, reaching for something to defend himself. There was a rush of excitement and panic as the patrons realized that it was, in fact, a bear. They scrabbled from their tables, leaving behind meals and drinks with reckless abandon. Chairs clattered to the floor as some hurried to pile out through a nearby window. Others shimmied along the wall by the stairs until they found the single door that led to the privies outside. A few brave individuals climbed the steps, darting into the rooms upstairs. In just a few moments, the tavern was empty, save for 2 villagers. The first was a man slumped over the counter at the far end of the bar. The acrid smell of booze was overpowering. He was snoring beneath a heavy, matted, fur-trimmed cloak that was draped around him like a blanket, too far gone to notice any apparent danger. The other was an embittered old man who remained seated at his table, chewing purposefully as he glared up at them. He looked like it would take nothing less than an unruly horde of ogres to deter him from his meal. The bartender gave a nervous lick of his lips as he watched the group settle into a now empty table, somehow undeterred by the lumbering beast behind them. His hand shook as he pointed at the creature.
"Is that thing with you?"
Atlas approached the bar, sliding neatly into a stool in front of the shaken barkeep. He offered him his most dashing smile.
"Who, Barry?"
He looked over his shoulder.
Don't mind him none. He's house-trained."
Barry ambled up to his friend and nosed him hard. He fell back on his hind legs to get a good look at the selection of alcohol this bartender offered and began to clamber onto a stool.
Right.
The barkeep couldn't peel his eyes away from the bear. He had so many questions, the most urgent of which was, is it going to eat me? But he couldn't seem to find the words. He watched as the bear continued to struggle, attempting to sit on the stool like a person, when the kitchen doors swung open behind him. The barmaid, who had been taking orders and slinging drinks not a moment before, backed out into the tavern with 2 food-laden platters. Unaware of the earlier commotion, she spun on her heel.
"All right, who ordered that?"
The trays smashed to the ground, but the sound of the shattering plates did little to hide her shriek of fear.
"Oh, God! Is that the bear?"
Atlas swiveled around on his stool to take in her dewy eyes and heart-shaped face. A sly, hungry grin crawled across his features as he slid off his seat and darted before her in one swift motion. He plucked up one of her dainty hands, kissing it gently before bowing.
"Worry not, my lovely. I control the beast, and he will not harm you."
He tugged on her hand, pulling her off balance and into his arms. He peered deep into her eyes and batted his long eyelashes.
"But surely, beauty such as yours could tame even the wildest of creatures."
Errik groaned as he and Evan dropped into vacant seats closest to the fire. The abandoned food left on the table was still warm and smelled, to be honest, quite good. He gave the tiny merc a flat look as he nodded his head in Atlas's direction.
"He reminds me more of Attila every minute."
Evan shrugged.
"Maybe that's why I like him."
Errik rolled his eyes.
"Yeah, well, you're not the one he plans to sell to the highest bidder."
The mage appeared at their table and clapped a hand on the king's shoulder.
"Talking about me."
The grin on his face was practically ear to ear. Errik gave him a flat look before shaking his head.
"Just admiring your social skills."
Atlas nodded.
"Aye, they are worthy of study, I'll give you that. Listen, you lot stay down here and enjoy the evening. Have some food and some drink, while I go upstairs with Giselle here."
He placed a hand on the opposite side of his face, covering his mouth.
"I'm going to show her a magic trick or 2.
The woman giggled at his gesture and tugged on his other hand, clearly impatient. Errik blanched as he noticed the short woman staring up at the mage with googly eyes. Atlas licked his lips as he turned to his furry friend.
Barry, you're in charge until I get back. Don't let these two leave. And you!
He paused, pointing at the harried barkeep.
Don't be giving him no more than a quarter cask. You got that? Quarter cask. And don't let him convince you otherwise. There's just no dealing with a drunk bear.
With that, he gave in to the pull of Giselle's alluring giggles, and the two disappeared upstairs. Errik made to scratch behind his ear, but found another twig there instead. He tugged it free and threw it into the fire.
I guess he's not exactly like Attila.
He scooped up a spoonful of the gray porridge and nibbled at the edge. The barkeep, horrified with having been left alone with a massive bear, nearly broke down in tears as he hefted a tiny barrel onto the counter. He pushed it, uncorked, towards Barry before backing into a corner, brandishing a broom out in front of him like a spear. Barry let out several grunts of approval and smashed open the lid of his keg like a honeypot, lapping at its contents with fervor. Errik let out a heavy sigh. The fire was warming him, and his sopping clothes seemed to be weighing on him less now that he was sitting. He might have even been able to enjoy his food, bland as it may be, had Bob not been openly hovering over his shoulder. Flickering firelight danced off his milky white eyes, and the shifting shadows cast his gaunt features into terrifying relief. Evan ripped off a chunk of stale bread, sponging up the gravy from his porridge and shoveling it into his mouth before he tapped his friend.
Bob is starting to attract some unwanted attention.
He tore into the roasted leg of some animal as he nodded in the direction of the old man alone at his table. Errik choked down the hunk of hard bread he had been working on and looked around the empty room. Sure enough, the old man at the table on the other side of the fireplace was staring up at their shambling companion with a slack jaw. Errik grumbled and tugged on the zombie's cloak.
You're going to get us thrown out. Sit down and act more human,
he hissed through grit teeth. Bob complied to the command and collapsed gracelessly into a chair next to the king. He reached out a withered hand and scooped a clump of porridge off the nearest plate, shoving it into his mouth. Unable to actually eat the food, he simply mashed it between his teeth, working his jaw up and down. Errik watched in horror as the porridge oozed out of Bob's Swiss cheese cheeks and felt a queasy rumble in his stomach. He pushed his own plate away, dry-heaving over his words.
Well, I'm not hungry anymore.
Evan let out a bark of a laugh, exposing a mouthful of half-chewed food. He swung out an arm and snatched up the plate, pulling it next to his own. He shoveled in another spoonful of food as he said, "Wuss."
Ugh, you're as bad as the zombie. And how can you eat? Aren't you worried about Vel?
Errik rolled his eyes a little, folding his arms over his chest.
I mean, not that I am. You just seem to hero-worship the guy.
Evan pointed his fork at Errik, a roast potato still skewered on it.
He's your brother. Of course you're worried.
He shoveled the food into his mouth and chewed before taking a long swig of the abandoned mug of ale.
Besides, you heard Casanova. He's got to be close by. I'm sure he'll turn up soon.
Errik raised a finger to argue against the validity of basing that assumption on so-called magic, but it died as they heard a cry of anguish from the innkeeper. They both glanced over to see him at the entrance of the kitchen, staring in horror as a tipsy bear rummaged through the cupboards within. He clenched his broom tight, took a deep breath, and plunged inside, the door swinging shut behind him. Errik leaned back in his chair and pulled the remains of the portal locker out of his pocket. He rolled it around in his hands, staring at the scorched marks along its surface.
You're right. I just wish he'd hurry up and find us. I want to get off this backwater world.
The clomp of heavy boots entering through the door brought his attention back up, half expecting to see his brother barging in. Instead, he spotted a group wearing familiar red and gold tabards. The guards had pulled off their helmets and were stomping the mud off their shoes. One of them, the man with the double bands of gold on his uniform, shook the wet hair out of his face and called out for the barkeep. Errik swallowed hard and pulled the hood of his cloak farther down over his face. An argument raged in his mind. He wanted to hide, but another part of him just wanted to get away from the charlatan and his pet. In the end, he decided he agreed with Evan. Better the devil you know. And if Atlas was anything like Attila, he'd come around eventually. Maybe. And truth be told, it was nice to see a familiar face, even if that face wanted to sell him. He shrank lower into his chair and nudged his companion. "Dude, hide!" Evan just waved him off, his mouth still full.
Nah, I'm eating.
Bob, seemingly compelled to follow every command, began to clumsily crawl beneath the table in a less than subtle manner. The guards, however, took no notice of their presence and continued on towards the bar. They set their helmets down on a nearby table and resumed their complaints about the unceasing rain. One moved away to warm himself by the fire, causing Errik to avert his gaze. The man nodded to the old codger, who just glared back and downed another spoonful of gruel like it was a threat. The leader glanced around the room, throwing his hands up in confusion. There were only a handful of patrons inside, and on a night like this, where was the barkeep and the serving wench? His gaze landed on the drunk at the end of the bar.
"Oi, look smart, lads. It's the captain of the guard."
His voice carried no honor with the words.
"So nice of you to save us a seat, Captain. Always thinking of your subordinates, eh?"
The others laughed as the leader sat on the stool nearest the unconscious man. Errik shifted in his chair a little to see the guard lean in close, pretending to listen to something only he could hear.
"What's that you say, Captain? First round's on you?"
The leader plucked up one of the abandoned tankards of ale on the bar. He took a swig of it and then laughed as he poured out the rest over the other man's head. The drunk snapped awake with a gasp and stumbled out of his stool. He tripped over the hem of his own cloak and crumpled to the ground, landing hard on his hands and knees, coughing and hacking. The leader of the guards let out a growl as he grabbed the back of the other man's cloak and sneered.
"Here, let me give you a hand."
Errik felt a wave of dread wash over him as he scrambled to push his chair back. The guard hauled on his handful of the drunk's cloak, sending him into the base of their table. It crumpled beneath the impact, splattering him and Evan with food and ale. The guard stalked towards them, leveling a finger at the drunk as he practically spat the words.
"I told you to stay out of the grisly orchard. Go back to that shit heap you crawled out of and stay there."
The figure rolled onto his back, sputtering around the stream of alcohol showering his face from the table above. He squinted up at the angry figure, confusion contorting his features. Erik's stomach gave a disconcerting lurch as he pushed himself out of his chair. "Well?" Of Bandits and Bad Magic is Book 3 of the ongoing series by Lesley Herron. Tune in every few weeks to hear the latest chapter as it's being written. If you'd like to listen to Books 1 and 2, you can find links in the description.
Wait, no, that's... Oh, God, that was a month's worth of flour. I just got that mutton delivered yesterday. Oh, you beast, that was my favorite part. No, not the apples, not the apples. Fine, eat the apples, but leave the butter. Eddie Witchen ate the butter. And he's found the fish. I bloody hate Wednesdays.